Hey guys, Chris here, and I'm a Ukrainian Canadian. Today is October 7th, 2024, and let's get to the news and map updates happening in Ukraine and Russia, shall we? So it's been a while since I made an update, a few days, so I apologize. I wasn't able to make an update. I had some projects on the side that were top priorities, so I'm back to making more regular updates. So I hope you guys can understand that. So without further ado, let's go to the map changes. And thankfully, there wasn't any huge changes on both sides. Yes, the problematic situation still remains in Donbas for Ukraine, where between Bakhmut all the way up to Vuhledar, the Russians are pushing really, really hard. This is the main thrust of their offensive. And for almost a year now, Ukraine hasn't really found a way to really fully stabilize the line. There hasn't been any massive breakthrough by the Russians in this direction, but they've been able to slowly, month by month, push through. After the fall of Avdiivka, this situation worsened for the Ukrainians, and you're seeing that, unfortunately, in the Pokrovsk direction, the Russians still slowly are gaining territory. A small field here, a small posadka there, a village taking in a matter of a few days, and Russia just slowly, pushing the boundaries. So this is extremely problematic for Ukraine because I think one of the reasons why Ukraine is struggling so much, it's not a mystery for us. It's really the fact that Russia, first of all, has a manpower advantage. It's obvious, but it's also the glide bombs that Russia's dropping on a daily basis on these Ukrainian positions, which is really, really problematic. Ukraine doesn't have an answer to these bombs. And again, it's all about shooting down and killing the archer, not the arrow. And Ukraine is still not being given permission by its partners in the West to use their weapons to strike deep within Russia. We know that Russia has a super high concentration of military bases and airfields in Rostov and Belgorod and other areas that are 200, 300 kilometers away from the front line, which has given a huge advantage for Russia because they can operate all of their jet fighters and their bombers from all these different airfields, move them around, shuffle them around. And Ukraine is not being given the chance to strike the archer. And that's extremely important. And as I've mentioned to you guys, I'm anticipating Ukraine to be given that permission. Likely, now that's my assessment. I could be totally wrong here, but being given the permission by the Biden administration to use the ATACMS ballistics after the US elections. I believe that Biden is afraid of escalating the situation and hurting Kamala's chances of winning the presidency and the Democratic Party being elected. So he's playing it very safe right now, trying to not escalate the situation. Now, this is my assessment, and I could be very wrong here, but I'm hoping that after the US elections in early November, that Ukraine is finally going to be given the permission to use American weapons on Russian territory. And Biden kind of solidifying his legacy that he gave that very decisive call to Ukraine and finally permitted Ukraine to start striking Russia with very, very devastating weapons. And we know the Russians are very afraid of them because ATACMS is not the same thing as UAV, right? And we've seen how effective even UAVs are on Russian military airfields and ammunition depots are. In the last few weeks, Ukraine has really been concentrating its attacks on ammunition depots. Let's not forget the successful Ukrainian attack in Tver a few weeks ago, where Ukraine was essentially able to destroy a massive, huge ammunition depot, one of the most modern ones, that held like something around like 30,000 tons of ammunition, where there was also North Korean ballistic missiles stored there, and perhaps even Iranian ballistic missiles. So this is the ammunition depot that Ukraine completely destroyed a few weeks ago, and there was another one just south of Taropets, about 15, 20 kilometers in Oktyabrski, something, I think somewhere around here, I believe it's this one, that Ukraine also obliterated. So Ukraine just needs the quantity to be able to replicate these attacks on a daily basis, right? Because what Ukraine is currently able to do is perhaps do it maybe once every 2 weeks. That's the best that Ukraine can do right now with its current supply of weapons that it's producing. And again, Ukraine has only been given the permission to strike Russia with Western weapons in the kind of the 100-kilometer buffer zone where Ukraine is currently fighting in Kursk, right? So they can only retaliate back against Russian forces that are planning an offensive on Ukraine positions, but they're still not being given the permission to fully utilize it the way that Ukraine wants it to. So that's the unfortunate situation. So that's why I'm saying that right now, I'm not anticipating anything to change in the Donbas situation. Ukraine will continue retreating little by little, backpedaling into Pokrovsk, to Kurakhove. Ukraine is really holding it strong, despite all the disadvantages that it has. Right, Russia has an overwhelming manpower advantage, overwhelming still artillery advantage over Ukraine, although that has been reduced severely thanks to Ukraine's initiative to strike ammunition depots. Now, the past advantage that Russia had was 8-1 in terms of shells and ammunition. And now some intelligence departments, like I believe the British intelligence, shared basically an assessment that they believe now this disadvantage to be 3-1 for Ukraine. So basically now Ukraine has been able to kind of reduce it by 50%, essentially, the advantage that Russia has, which is a huge, huge change of the situation. But imagine what Ukraine could do with long range weapons. And the United States has thousands of ATACMs available. At the very least, they could provide a few hundred, and that can really make a difference, especially when we're looking at, the few dozen airfields and bases that Russia has right by the border. That could be devastating for them. So that's the situation. You guys can see that if we're looking at the map as well, right now where the Russians are really pushing is around Selidove. You can see that the Russians are always doing the same tactic, really pushing on the flanks. They're not trying to go head first into the city. They're forcing the flanks and they're trying to go for an encirclement. For them, Selidove is important to then get to Pokrovsk. And additionally, south of Selidove, you can see that there's Kurakhivka and Kurakhove. So there's another push that the Russians are doing here to push through the fields of Kurakhivka, and then they're going to want to get to Kurakhove. This is one of the very problematic front lines for the Russians. We're having huge losses here. I've shared with you guys multiple times the huge defeats of Russian armored columns in this specific direction, where Russia just throwing dozens of armored vehicles per day. And the Ukraine's really holding a strong defense here. But unfortunately, the situation becomes a little bit more difficult for Ukraine because of the loss of Vuhledar. And after Vuhledar, now the Russians have a staging area here, which will allow them to go and pressure even more Kurakhove from the south here, which is really, really going to be difficult for the 46th Brigade that is currently holding Kurakhove. But there's also the 72nd Brigade that had to retreat back from Vuhledar. So they will likely join forces to, mount another defense at better positions. So that's the situation with Donbas right now. Very difficult, and unfortunately, I'm not really seeing any changes that will go into Ukraine's favor. The only thing I can mention, my last point, is that I've mentioned this briefly in my previous video, but I'm anticipating that the Russian assaults will definitely decrease as winter comes. And we already know that the term Rasputitsa, which is kind of this freeze and thaw cycle that starts kind of end of the autumn, beginning of winter, which will really complicate Russian advancements because these muddy roads will be kind of impossible to cross with massive tanks and massive armored vehicles. And so Russian maneuverability and mobility will be severely hampered in the winter as you have this constant kind of slushy weather, especially until December, early January. There's definitely going to be a kind of a terrible conditions for offensive operations for the Russians. So there could be a decrease of up to 20% of Russian assaults in this direction. So, nature will be in Ukraine's favor for the winter, but that's not going to stop the Russians from trying to push through because they still have so much meat available. There's a new report that basically confirmed that Russia is able to recruit over 225,000 soldiers per year, right? A massive amount, and they have plenty of meat to spare. So Ukraine doesn't have a choice but to just kind of retreat back and try to make the losses as catastrophic as possible for the Russians. And for those saying, well, Ukraine is always going backpedaling, Ukraine needs to stop and hope for ceasefire negotiations. You really think Russia's going to stop even after ceasefire is met? Russia will just rearm and try to strike back as quickly as possible. Trust me when I'm saying this, the losses that Ukraine currently has and will have as they continue fighting are going to be far less compared to a ceasefire that will be imposed in Ukraine on Ukraine, and then Russia is going to strike again, and that's going to just triple and quadruple the Ukraine losses, we're going to be talking about a genocidal war that Russia is going to be waging that's going to be far more brutal, as we've given them the opportunity to rearm and adapt, right? And Russia is going to do everything possible to destroy Ukraine. So Ukraine simply doesn't have the choice but to continue defending. And we're seeing that Ukraine isn't, it's not like Ukraine just lost the entire war because they had to retreat back from Vuhledar or even Avdiivka. What we're seeing is that the Ukrainians are just retreating back to better positions and they continue fighting. And it's all about exhausting the Russians. So as long as the Western partners continue helping Ukraine, assisting them with weapons, and hopefully in the next few months giving the signals that we're going to be behind Ukraine no matter what, we're going to give Ukraine even more weapons, Ukraine, I believe, will win. And that's just the biggest factor is just how much the West wants Ukraine to win, because there is a direct correlation with how much the West supports Ukraine and how effective Ukraine is on the battlefield. So that's for Donbas. Additionally, if there's just one last little update I wanted to give you guys on the map is there's this little push that the Russians are doing in the middle of kind of Luhansk, northern Luhansk area, kind of Luhansk and Kharkiv area here around Kupiansk, which is kind of problematic for the Ukrainians. It's nothing catastrophic because the Ukrainians still have many other roads that they can access, but you can see the Russians are trying to really cut off from Pishchane, and they try to get to Sinkove. But as you can see as well, they're pushing a little bit north and south as well. So they're kind of trying to break through in this area. And what I believe is they're going to try to do after is try to push north in Kupiansk and also a little bit south, trying to stretch the territory that they're controlling. So this is another front line that I'm looking at, and I'm seeing that the Russians are slowly advancing as well. So again, I'm hoping that Ukrainians will have an answer, or at least their strategy will be just to cut off the Russians here as they get to Sinkove, and they won't be able to really push through anymore. But this is another of these front lines that has become much more visible in the last few weeks, as the Russians really kind of doubled down here and began a new offensive operation around northern Kharkiv area. So that's the situation for the map. One last thing, or I guess two things I want to mention. Speaking of the importance of Western decisiveness, Zelensky mentioned, we know that Ramstein is coming up on October 12th, and Zelensky has been hinting that there will be very historic decisions that will be made in Ramstein. And I'm really hoping, again, it's an assumption, it could be totally wrong, that Ukraine will finally be given, or talks will begin for the Ukrainian membership into NATO. That's going to be one of those an absolute must for Ukraine in order for us to secure at least a decent peace, right? Even if, let's say, Ukraine is not able to retake its territory, which is very unlikely at this stage in Donbas and the south of Ukraine, a NATO membership for Ukraine is going to be huge in securing the future of the country, right? Because if you're not giving any security guarantees to Ukraine, you're just telling them, hey, we've brokered a deal between Russia and Ukraine. Kind of the same thing like Minsk 1 and Minsk 2. We're going to have another, full-scale invasion in a few months, if not, max a few years, right? Russia will not wait to launch another attack. They will use the time and try to rearm as quickly as possible. So Ukraine absolutely needs to be part of NATO, at the very least, have those security guarantees so we can at least have some sort of a safety net if anything happens again. So Zelensky mentions that there will be some historic decisions. I hope that's not just words and something actually will happen as well. Because as we've seen in the past, it's not the first time Zelensky or one of his ministers mentioned that there was going to be a historic decision being made by the partners and then nothing happens. So I'm kind of taking this with a little grain of salt, but I'm hoping that I'd rather be pleasantly surprised than bitterly disappointed. And last but not least, another excellent Ukrainian strike in Fedosia. So the Ukrainians have renewed their attacks on Crimea. For the last few weeks, it's been more or less quiet, I would say. Not a lot of Ukrainian strikes on the Crimean Peninsula. Likely that the Russians have stopped really moving a lot of assets into the Crimean Peninsula. Not as much as they used to, because we remember that even a few months ago, like in spring, early summer, Ukraine was striking Crimea like every other day, destroying S-300 systems, S-400 systems, some other command centers, an airfield being destroyed, or attacked, I should say, not destroyed. So Ukraine really raised the intensity, and then I would say in the last month or two, there's been less activity in the Crimean Peninsula. But Ukraine struck in Fedosia, and they struck a massive oil depot located by the port of Fedosia, which is really important because it's an important port for the Russians. And based on the videos, there are about 5 or 6 cisterns currently burning in full, which will severely weaken Russian logistics in the south. Of course, they're using these oil depots to refuel their trucks, refuel their jet fighters on the multiple airfields that they have in the Crimean Peninsula. So this is a very important strike by the Ukrainians, and hoping that by the end of the year, Ukraine will finally destroy the Kerch Bridge. I think Ukraine has those capabilities. They're just waiting for the right moment to do so. So hopefully, again, it's my assessment, but Ukraine will be able to do that. We'll decide to do that by the end of the year, give us a New Year gift, because we know that the Ukrainian Hur mentioned that they're planning to destroy this bridge by the end of 2024. So fingers crossed that this bridge will fully be destroyed, and that will just severely weaken Russian logistics even more in the south, in Crimea, and also the south of Ukraine. Now they're going to have to go through Rostov, the connections that they have through Rostov, to be able to resupply the forces in Kherson and Zaporizhia, which is going to be far more costly for the Russians. So that's the video for today, guys. I hope you guys enjoyed the update. I've talked a lot about different things, including Ukraine's NATO membership, which I hope is going to happen soon. So let's hope that Ramstein will be fruitful for Ukraine. We're going to have a lot of important announcements and historic announcements as well. And yeah, thank you so much for your support, and I'll see you guys in the next one. Slava Ukraini!